Before we begin, I want to warn you that this story contains mature themes. It deals with the challenges of new motherhood, family relationships, and infidelity. If these topics make you uncomfortable, you might want to stop watching now. My name is Evelyn Dalton, and it's hard to even say it out loud, but this is my story. I've been carrying it inside for years, burying it so deep that I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. But it is real, and I can't keep pretending anymore. I was 16 when my mom died. And, I don't think I can explain how much of a shock it was. She was my everything. She wasn't just my mom, she was my best friend. She was the person who could look at me and just, no. She'd smile at me in this way that made me feel like everything was going to be okay, even when it wasn't. And she always told me I reminded her of herself, her stubborn streak, her messy hair, even the way I laughed. And I loved that, being compared to her. She was everything I wanted to be. When she got sick, it was like the world stopped spinning. It didn't make sense. She wasn't supposed to get sick like that. Moms aren't supposed to leave. They're supposed to always be there, right? But she wasn't. Every day, I watched her get weaker and weaker. And when she finally passed, it felt like someone had ripped me in half. I wasn't just losing her, I was losing myself. I didn't even recognize the person I was without her. After the funeral, everything changed. It was just me and my dad, Fletcher Flynn. And to be honest, I never really felt that close to him. Mom was the glue that held us together. Without her, it felt like we were two strangers living in the same house. I mean, we didn't even talk about her. Not really. He just threw himself into, I don't know, being busy. Cleaning. Rearranging furniture. Doing anything to avoid talking about the fact that she was gone. And I guess, in my own way, I was doing the same thing. I didn't know how to process it. I felt like the house was too big, too quiet. It didn't feel like home anymore. Nothing did. But then, there were these moments where Dad wasn't busy. He wasn't cleaning or moving things around. And in those moments, he seemed different. I don't know how to explain it, but I started noticing things. Like the way he'd look at me. Or the way he'd just sit on the sofa, staring at nothing. And at first, I thought maybe he was just grieving in his own way, you know? We'd both lost someone we loved. But the way he looked at me sometimes, it didn't feel right. It made my skin crawl, but I didn't want to believe it. I remember this one night, 3 days after the funeral. We were sitting on the sofa. I don't even remember what we were watching, some old movie, I think. I wasn't paying attention. My head was just elsewhere. And then, out of nowhere, he said, "You look just like her. You're beautiful like your mum." I didn't know what to say. I mean, it sounded like a compliment, right? But there was something in the way he said it. Something in his voice. And the way he looked at me when he said it. I don't even know how to describe it. It just felt wrong. But I brushed it off. I told myself I was imagining things. He was my dad. Dads don't think of their daughters like that, right? So I told myself I was being stupid, and I tried to forget about it. But I couldn't forget. Because that wasn't the only time. There were little things after that. Things he'd say. The way he'd touch my shoulder or my arm. It was all so subtle, but it didn't feel like a dad anymore. And I kept trying to convince myself that it was just my grief messing with my head. That I was overthinking everything. Because the alternative, the idea that my dad was looking at me like that, was just too much to handle. I wasn't ready to face it. Not then. I think deep down, I knew something was wrong. But I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to believe that my own father could see me that way. So I ignored it. I ignored the way my stomach twisted every time he got too close. I ignored the way I flinched when he put his hand on my knee. I ignored it all, because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know how to make it stop. That night, sitting on the sofa, was the beginning of everything. I didn't know it at the time, but my life was about to change forever. And not in a way I could have ever prepared for. If you're still with me, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. Trust me, there's so much more to uncover. Before everything happened, before my mom got sick, our family was happy. Or, at least, it felt that way. My mom, Theodora, was the kind of person who lit up a room just by being in it. She was funny, smart, and kind in a way that made everyone around her feel special. She had this laugh, it was loud, a little embarrassing, but it made you want to laugh with her. She didn't care what people thought about her. She was unapologetically herself. And I loved that about her. She was my safe place. She was the person I could tell anything to. When I had a bad day, or when I didn't know what to do, she'd sit with me at the kitchen table, make us both tea, and just listen. Really listen. Sometimes she'd tell me what I needed to hear, even if I didn't want to hear it. Other times, she'd just let me cry. But she was always there. She always had my back. And my dad. Fletcher, he was different. He wasn't bad or anything, not back then. But he was quieter, more distant. He wasn't the type to sit and talk about feelings, and he didn't really know how to handle me the way Mum did. He loved us in his own way, I think, but it was different. Mum was the heart of the family. She was what kept us together. When she got sick, it was like everything started to fall apart. At first, it was little things. She was tired all the time, or she'd forget things she never used to forget. Then it got worse. Doctor appointments, treatments, hospital visits, it all happened so fast. I remember sitting in her hospital room, holding her hand, trying to stay strong for her even though I was breaking inside. I couldn't imagine a world without her. I didn't want to imagine it. And the whole time, Dad just checked out. He was there physically, but it was like he'd already given up on her. On us. When she passed, something in him snapped. He didn't cry at the funeral. He barely spoke to anyone. He just stood there, staring at her casket, like he was a million miles away. And after that, he threw himself into I don't even know what. Cleaning. Fixing things around the house that weren't broken. He'd spend hours rearranging furniture, scrubbing the same spot on the floor over and over, like if he just kept moving, he wouldn't have to think about her being gone. I thought maybe it was his way of grieving. People grieve differently, right? I figured he just needed time. But it wasn't just the cleaning or the silence. It was the way he looked at me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I mean, we'd both lost her. We were both hurting. I thought maybe he saw her when he looked at me, and that's why his gaze lingered a little too long. But it wasn't that. It was something else. Something I didn't want to admit to myself. It started with little things. Compliments, mostly. He'd say, "You're so beautiful, just like your mom." And I thought that was normal, you know? Dads are supposed to say nice things like that. But then he started touching me. Not in a way that felt like a father. He'd put his hand on my knee and leave it there too long, or he'd brush my hair out of my face and let his fingers linger on my cheek. And every time it happened, I'd tell myself it didn't mean anything. That I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The first time it happened, the first time he crossed the line, was 3 days after the funeral. I was sitting on the sofa with him, just existing. We weren't talking. The house was so quiet, and I felt like I was drowning in the silence. And then he said it again, "You're beautiful, just like your mum." Only this time, he didn't stop there. He reached over and put his hand on my chest. I froze. I didn't know what to do, what to say. I just sat there, staring at the TV like if I didn't move, if I didn't react, it wouldn't be real. But it was real. His hand moved under my shirt, and I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. And before I could even process what was happening, he was pulling me onto the floor. And then, he was on top of me. It hurt. It hurt so much, but I didn't fight back. I couldn't. I was too scared, too shocked, too frozen. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to be over. And when it was, he didn't say anything. He didn't look at me. He just got up and went to bed, like nothing had happened. And I stayed there. On the floor. Crying. Hating myself for not stopping him, for not screaming, for not running away. I locked myself in my room after that. For a week, I didn't come out. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I just sat there, replaying it in my head, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. What I'd done to make him do that to me. And when he finally came to my room, I thought he was going to apologize. I thought maybe he'd tell me it was a mistake, that he'd never do it again. But that's not what happened. He handed me a pregnancy test. And when it came back negative, he promised to be more careful next time. Next time. I can't even explain what that did to me. I felt like I'd died inside. Like I wasn't even a person anymore. I was just nothing. That was the beginning of the end for me. I didn't know it then, but that was the night I stopped being a daughter. I stopped being me. I became something else. Something I didn't recognize. And I didn't know how to make it stop. For a while, after that first night, I thought the worst part was how it made me feel. The way my stomach churned. The way my skin felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. I felt disgusting, like there was something wrong with me, something broken inside. Every time he touched me, I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just froze. Over and over again, I froze. And afterward, when he left, I'd curl up in my bed and cry until my throat hurt. Then I'd sit in front of the mirror and just stare at myself. I didn't even recognize the girl looking back at me. I'd try to scrub my skin until it was raw, but it didn't make me feel clean. Nothing did. I felt hollow, like a shell of a person. And I hated myself for letting it happen. I'd tell myself, next time, you'll stop him. You'll say no. You'll scream. But when the next time came, I'd freeze all over again. I'd shut down completely, like my brain and body didn't know how to work anymore. And every time it happened, I hated myself more. Because if I wasn't fighting back, wasn't running away, wasn't that the same as letting it happen? Wasn't that the same as agreeing to it? I started to believe it was my fault. He never said it out loud, but I could feel it in the way he talked to me. The things he'd say. Like, "You're all I have now, Evelyn. You're the only one who understands me." Or, "I can't help it, you just remind me so much of your mum." And the worst one, "You don't want to see me fall apart, do you?" What was I supposed to say to that? He made it sound like I was keeping him together. Like I was responsible for him. And part of me wanted to believe that. Part of me wanted to think I was helping him in some way, that I was doing something good. Because the alternative, the idea that my own dad was hurting me, and that I couldn't stop him, was too much to handle. So I let him convince me. I let him make me believe it was my job to keep him from falling apart. But the thing is, I was the one falling apart. Every time he came into my room, a little piece of me disappeared. And after a while, there was nothing left. No anger. No sadness. No nothing. I stopped crying. I stopped feeling sick. I just shut down. I went numb. It was the only way I could survive it. After a while, it didn't even feel like it was happening to me. It felt like I was watching someone else's life from far away. And the more I distanced myself from it, the more I convinced myself it wasn't really abuse. Because if I wasn't fighting it, if I wasn't crying or screaming, then maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I wanted it to happen. Maybe it wasn't his fault. Maybe it was mine. I hated myself for thinking that. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop replaying that first night in my head, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. Was it something I said? Something I wore? Should I have fought harder? Should I have screamed? It didn't matter that I was only 16. It didn't matter that he was my dad. I still blamed myself. And the more I blamed myself, the easier it was to let it keep happening. Because if it was my fault, then it wasn't really abuse. And if it wasn't really abuse, then maybe I wasn't as broken as I felt. We acted like everything was normal the rest of the time. He'd come into my room at night, and the next morning, we'd sit at the breakfast table like nothing had happened. He'd ask me about school. I'd tell him about a test I had coming up, or what my teachers were like, or some stupid drama happening with my classmates. And we'd laugh. We'd actually laugh. Like we were just a regular father and daughter. And sometimes, for a little while, I almost believed it. I almost believed we were normal. And then Dorothy Pitts came along. She was this woman from my dad's work, and when they started dating, I thought maybe. I don't know. Maybe it was over. Maybe she was what he needed. And for a few months, it stopped. He didn't come into my room at night. He didn't touch me. He didn't say anything inappropriate. He was just Dad. For the first time in years, he was just my dad. I should have felt relieved. And I did. But I also felt jealous. I hated her. I hated the way he looked at her. I hated the way he laughed at her jokes. I hated the way she got to take up all his attention. And I hated myself for feeling that way. I didn't even want him, not really, but seeing him with her made my stomach twist. Because even though what he'd been doing to me was wrong, it was ours. It was my secret, my shame, and watching him share it with someone else made me feel like I was being ripped apart all over again. Eventually, he brought her into my room. I'll never forget that night. I remember the way she smiled at me, like we were in this together. Like this was normal. And I remember just lying there, completely numb, while she climbed into bed next to me. It was like I wasn't even a person anymore. I was just a thing. Something they could use and pass around and throw away when they were done. I couldn't take it. After a while, I told him I couldn't do it anymore. I begged him to stop bringing her into my room. I told him it made me feel sick, and he actually apologized. He said he was sorry if he'd made me jealous. And then he dumped her. Just like that. Like it was no big deal. And I hated myself even more after that. Because it felt like he'd done it for me. Like my feelings mattered to him. And for a little while, I thought maybe that meant he cared. Maybe, deep down, he really loved me. But then it started again, and I realized it had never been about me. It had never been about love. It was about control. It was about him. By then, I didn't even know who I was anymore. I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't a person. I was just his. When I got to university, I didn't expect anything to change. I mean, I was still living at home with him. He wouldn't let me move away. Said it wasn't safe. Said I'd be too far if anything happened to me. And I didn't argue. I didn't know how to. So I stayed. I commuted to school every day, pretending like everything was fine. Like I was just another 19-year-old trying to figure out her life. But the truth was, I wasn't like the other students. I'd sit in lectures and watch the people around me laughing and talking like the world was theirs for the taking, and I'd feel so separate. Like I didn't belong there. Like I wasn't even real. I'd go through the motions, take notes, hand in assignments, smile at people when they smiled at me, but I felt like a ghost. Like no one really saw me. And then I met Kira Leal. She sat next to me in one of my lectures. I don't even remember what the class was, it feels like a blur now. But I remember her. I remember the way she looked at me, like I was a person. Like she actually saw me. She was warm and easy to talk to, and for some reason, I didn't feel the need to put on a mask around her. I didn't feel like I had to pretend. At first, it was just little things. She'd ask me to grab coffee after class, or we'd sit in the library together and study. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel so alone. She didn't push me to talk about myself, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't ready to tell anyone the truth. But just being around her, it was like breathing fresh air after being trapped in a dark room for too long. I didn't realize how suffocated I'd been until I met her. She made me laugh. Not the fake laugh I used with my dad or my classmates, but a real laugh. The kind that makes your stomach hurt and your cheeks ache. I didn't think I could feel like that anymore. And the more time I spent with her, the more I started to see how different my life could be. How different it should be. Kira had this way of making me feel safe without even trying. Like she wasn't expecting anything from me. Like I could just be. And I didn't know how much I needed that until she gave it to me. For so long, I'd been carrying this weight around, this shame, this fear. And I'd convinced myself that I deserved it. That I wasn't worth anything better. But when I was with her, I started to question that. I started to wonder if maybe I deserved more. Maybe I deserved to be happy. For months, I kept my secret from her. She knew I had something I wasn't telling her. She could see it in the way I flinched when someone touched me, or the way I'd zone out during conversations. But she never pushed. She just stayed. And that meant everything to me. After a while, I started to fall for her. I didn't mean to, and it scared me. It scared me so much, because I didn't know how to feel anything good without feeling bad too. Love wasn't something I understood anymore. It was tangled up in fear and pain and control. So when I realized I had feelings for her, my first instinct was to run. But I didn't. I stayed. Because for the first time, I wanted something more for myself. I wanted to see what my life could be like without him. Without shame. One night, after months of just being friends, Kira asked me to come back to her room. She lived in the halls on campus, and I'd never been there before. I said yes, even though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I trusted her. I trusted her more than I'd ever trusted anyone in my life. When we got to her room, she made me tea and put on some music. It was so normal. So safe. I sat on her bed, and we talked for hours. About nothing. About everything. And then, at some point, she leaned in to kiss me. And for a second, it felt like the whole world stopped. Like it was just me and her, and nothing else mattered. But then she touched me. Just lightly, just her hand on my arm. And it was like my body short-circuited. All the fear, all the shame, all the memories I'd tried to bury came flooding back. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my hands were shaking, and before I knew it, I was crying. Not quiet tears, but the kind that makes your whole body ache. And Kira, she didn't freak out. She didn't get mad. She just held my hand and said, "It's okay. You don't have to tell me. I'm here." That moment broke something in me. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to tell her everything. But the words wouldn't come. I couldn't say it out loud, because saying it would make it real. And I wasn't ready for that. So I just sat there, sobbing in her arms, while she stroked my hair and told me it was okay. After that night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that what my dad had done to me wasn't abuse. I couldn't keep pretending that it hadn't destroyed me. Kira made me see that I deserved more, just by being herself, just by showing me kindness. And for the first time, I started to realize that what happened to me wasn't my fault. I wasn't to blame. I didn't deserve it. And that thought, it scared me. Because if it wasn't my fault, then I had to face the fact that my dad had done something horrible. And I wasn't sure I was strong enough to face that. But I wanted to try. For Kira. For myself. I wanted to believe that I could be more than what he'd made me. I wanted to believe that I could be happy. When I started dating Kira, I didn't tell my dad much. I told him I was seeing someone, but I didn't say it was a girl. I didn't tell him her name. I didn't give him any details. I didn't trust him with that part of my life. I didn't want him anywhere near it. But he was curious. He'd ask little questions, like, where'd you meet him, or, is he treating you right? And I'd give vague answers because I didn't know how else to handle it. At first, I thought he'd be angry. I thought he'd try to control me, the way he always had, but he didn't. For a while, he actually seemed different. He wasn't coming into my room at night. He wasn't touching me or saying anything inappropriate. He even asked me how school was going, like he actually cared. And for the first time in years, I let myself relax. I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe this new relationship I'd told him about scared him off. Or maybe he was finally realizing how wrong it all was. For 2 months, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't living in constant fear. I wasn't jumping at every little sound in the hallway. I wasn't holding my breath every time I heard his footsteps at night. And even though I knew it was too good to be true, I let myself believe it anyway. I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I could have a normal life. That maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought I was. But it didn't last. It never does it? One night, he came into my room again. It had been so long since the last time that I almost didn't recognize the sound of the door opening. I was half asleep when I felt him climb onto my bed. And when I realized what was happening, my whole body froze, just like it always did. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just lay there, staring at the wall, while This time, he didn't say anything. He didn't try to comfort me or make excuses. He didn't promise to be careful, the way he used to. He was rough. It felt like he was punishing me, but I didn't know what I'd done wrong. I wanted to ask him, but I couldn't get the words out. And when it was over, he just left. He didn't even look at me. He just walked out of the room like I wasn't even there. Like I didn't exist. I don't know how long I lay there after he left. It could have been minutes, or hours. I just remember staring at the ceiling, feeling like I wasn't even in my own body anymore. I couldn't cry. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just kept hearing his voice in my head, all the things he used to say to me, "You're all I have, you're just like your mum, we have to take care of each other." And for the first time, I didn't believe him. I didn't believe any of it. All I could think was, I can't do this anymore. I can't stay here. That was the moment I knew I had to leave. I didn't know how. I didn't know where I'd go. But I knew I couldn't stay. Not after that. Not after everything. If I stayed, he was going to destroy me. Completely. And I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let him take what little was left of me. I started packing as soon as the sun came up. I didn't have much, just a backpack and a few clothes. I didn't want to take anything that would make him notice I was gone. I wanted to disappear as quietly as possible. I kept thinking, what if he catches me? What if he comes back before I'm done? What if he stops me? My hands were shaking so bad I could barely zip up my bag. Every sound in the house made me jump. Every creak in the floorboards made my heart race. I waited until he left for the supermarket. He always went on Sunday mornings. It was like clockwork. As soon as I heard the door close, I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't even look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, all the way to the train station. My chest was tight, my legs were burning, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Not until I was on that train, with the doors closed behind me. When I sat down, I pulled out my phone and called Kira. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it, but I managed to press her name. When she answered, I didn't even say hello. I just blurted it out, I need to stay with you. Please. Can I stay with you? She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just said, of course. Come over. I'll meet you at the station. And that was it. That was all I needed to hear. I didn't tell her what had happened, not then. I couldn't. But just knowing she was there, knowing I had somewhere safe to go, it gave me the strength to keep going. I stared out the window for the rest of the train ride, watching the fields and houses blur together. And for the first time in years, I felt a tiny flicker of hope. It was small, barely there, but it was enough. Enough to make me believe that maybe, just maybe, I could start over. That maybe I could find a way to be whole again. But even as I sat there, miles away from him, I couldn't stop the fear. I kept thinking about all the things he used to say to me, all the ways he made me believe it was my fault. And I wondered if he'd come looking for me. If he'd try to drag me back. Part of me even felt guilty for leaving, like I was betraying him somehow. Like I was abandoning him, the way he used to say everyone else had. And I hated that I still cared. I hated that even after everything he'd done, a part of me still felt responsible for him. I tried to push those thoughts away. I tried to focus on Kira. On the fact that I was finally free. But it didn't feel real yet. I didn't feel free. Not completely. Not yet. But I was ready to try. For the first time, I was ready to try. Walking to the train station that morning, I felt like I was walking through water. Every step was heavy, like my legs didn't want to move, like some invisible force was pulling me back to that house. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there, running after me, dragging me back. But the street was empty. It was just me and the sound of my suitcase wheels rattling over the sidewalk. I told myself not to think about him. Not to think about the things he'd said or the way he'd made me feel. But the harder I tried not to, the louder his voice got in my head. You're all I have, Evelyn. I can't do this without you. You're just like your mum. It was like he was still there, whispering in my ear, reminding me that I was the one walking away. That I was the one leaving him. And even though I knew what he did was wrong, even though I knew I had every right to leave, I still felt guilty. Isn't that messed up? After everything he'd done to me, I still felt like I was betraying him. I kept thinking, what if he's right? What if I'm abandoning him? What if I'm just as bad as he said I was? And then there was this other voice in my head, quieter, but stronger, telling me, you have to do this. You have to leave. If you don't, he'll destroy you. And that voice, it was the only thing that kept me moving. It was the only thing that kept me from turning around and going back. When I got to the station, my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even hold my ticket properly. I remember standing on the platform, looking down the tracks, and thinking, what if I can't do this? What if I get on that train, and nothing changes? What if I can't leave this behind? I didn't know if I could tell Kira the truth. I didn't know if I could tell anyone. And I was so scared that if I did, they'd look at me the same way I looked at myself, like I was broken. Like I was disgusting. Like I wasn't worth saving. But I got on the train anyway. And the whole ride to Kira's, I just stared out the window, trying not to cry. Trying not to think about all the times I'd convinced myself that this was my fault. That I'd done something to deserve it. That maybe, deep down, I wanted it. It's terrifying how easy it is to believe that. How easy it is to let someone else's words become your truth. And for so long, his voice was the only one I listened to. His voice was the only one that mattered. And that's what hurt the most, not just what he did to me, but the way he made me believe it was love. The way he made me believe that I didn't deserve anything better. When I finally got to Kira's, she was waiting for me at the station. She hugged me before I could say anything, and I just broke. Right there on the platform, in front of everyone. I couldn't hold it together anymore. She didn't ask me what was wrong. She didn't push me to talk. She just held me and said, "You're safe now." And for the first time in my life, I actually believed it. I believed her. That night, after we got back to her room, I couldn't stop thinking about everything I'd left behind. The house. The memories. Him. I kept wondering if he was looking for me. If he was angry. If he was scared. And I hated myself for caring. I hated myself for worrying about him after everything he'd done. But I couldn't help it. That's what years of manipulation does to you. It warps your brain. It makes you feel like you're the one who's broken, like you're the one who did something wrong. And even now, even as I'm sitting here, telling you all of this, I still feel that guilt. I still hear his voice in the back of my head, telling me that I'm the one to blame. But there's another voice now, too. It's quieter, but it's getting louder every day. It's telling me that what happened wasn't my fault. That I didn't deserve it. That none of it was okay. And it's hard to believe that sometimes. It's hard to drown out all the lies he told me. But I'm trying. For the first time, I'm really trying. Kira's been amazing. She doesn't push me to talk about what happened, but she listens when I'm ready. She tells me that I'm strong, even when I don't feel like it. She tells me that I deserve to be happy. And for the first time, I think I'm starting to believe her. I'm starting to believe that I deserve more than what he gave me. That I deserve love that doesn't hurt. That I deserve to feel safe in my own skin. I've been thinking about going to therapy. I don't know if I'm ready, but I think I need to try. I don't want to carry this around with me anymore. I don't want to let him control me from the shadows. I don't want to feel like I'm stuck in the past. I want to let go of the guilt. I want to let go of the shame. I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and see someone who's whole. Someone who's worth saving. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know how long it'll take to feel normal again, or if I ever will. But I do know one thing, I'm not going back. I'm never going back. I've spent too many years letting him define me, letting his actions control my life. And I'm done. I'm done letting him win. From now on, I'm going to fight for myself. For my happiness. For my future. And for the first time in a long time, I actually believe I can. Either way, I want to hear what you think. Tell me, what would you do if your world fell apart like mine did? How would you move forward? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.